The story of the Korean peninsula does not begin with the maps of today, but with the very bedrock of the earth, the rugged granite peaks of the Taebaek Mountains, the winding silver veins of the Han and Amnok rivers, and the rhythmic pulse of the Yellow Sea. Imagine yourself standing on a high ridge at the dawn of time. The air is exceptionally still, carrying the crisp, cold scent of ancient snow and the earthy perfume of deep, untouched forests. Above, the sky is a vast, velvet canvas of stars, silent and eternal. This is the stage upon which the Korean spirit first began to stir. In the deepest well of human memory, we find the legend of Dangun, a story that bridges the gap between the celestial and the terrestrial. It is said that in the beginning, Hwanin, the Lord of Heaven, had a son named Hwanung, who yearned to descend from the clouds and live among the humans. He looked down upon the emerald valleys and the jagged peaks and saw a land of profound beauty. With his father's blessing, Hwanung descended to the Taebaek Mountains, accompanied by 3,000 followers and the three ministers of the world, the Earl of Wind, the Master of Rain, and the Lord of Clouds. They settled beneath a magnificent ancient sandalwood tree, creating a divine city where the laws of nature and the wisdom of the heavens met. During this time, a bear and a tiger lived in a large, cool cave near the sandalwood tree. They watched the heavenly prince and, moved by his wisdom, prayed to him, expressing a deep desire to become human. Hwanung, testing their resolve, gave them 20 cloves of garlic and a bundle of sacred mugwort. He told them that if they could stay within the darkness of their cave for 100 days, eating only these plants and avoiding the sunlight, they would be transformed. The tiger, restless and impulsive, found the trial too difficult and fled into the forest after only a few days, but the bear remained. She sat in the silence, her spirit steady and patient, until on the 21st day her form shifted. She emerged into the light as a woman, Eungnye. In time, she and Hwanung were wed, and their son was Dangun Wanggeom, the king of Sandalwood, the legendary founder of Gojoseon, the first kingdom of the Korean people. Gojoseon was not merely a kingdom, it was the dawn of a civilization. Imagine the quiet villages of this era, established over 4,000 years ago. Life moved to the slow, steady rhythm of the seasons. The people were masters of the Bronze Age, their artisans spending weeks polishing bronze mirrors until they shone like the sun, and crafting mandolin-shaped daggers that were as much works of art as they were tools of protection. They lived under the 8 laws, a simple yet profound code that prioritized the sanctity of life and the protection of labor. It was a society built on the concept of Hongik-Ingun, the devotion to the welfare of all humanity. This principle, born in the Bronze Age, remains a heartbeat of the Korean identity even now. As the centuries drifted by, like cherry blossoms on a stream, Gojoseon grew into a powerful confederacy, its influence stretching across the northern peninsula and into Manchuria. But time eventually brought change, and by the 2nd century BCE, the First Kingdom began to fracture under the pressure of expanding empires from the west. From its embers, a new era of vibrant competing powers began to take shape. In the south, the land was home to the Samhan, 3 confederacies known as Mahan, Jinhan, and Beonhan. Imagine these southern lands as a lush patchwork of rice paddies and coastal villages. The people of the Samhan were pioneers of agriculture, developing sophisticated irrigation systems to harness the summer rains. They were a people of music and celebration. After the spring planting and the autumn harvest, they would gather for days of dancing and communal singing, offering thanks to the spirits of the earth. Beonhan, in particular, was famed for its iron, Traders from across the seas would come to exchange gold and silk for the high-quality iron of the south, which was so plentiful it was used as a form of currency, traded in heavy iron bars. While the south flourished in trade and farming, the north saw the rise of a warrior spirit. From the rugged northern mountains emerged the kingdom of Goguryeo. Its founding is a tale of mythic proportions, the story of Jumung, a divine archer who fled his home and established a new capital along the Amnok River. Goguryeo was a land of granite and wind. Its people were shaped by the harshness of the terrain. They were exceptional horsemen and builders of formidable mountain fortresses. Imagine the sheer scale of Goguryeo's ambition. Their warriors, clad in scale armor that glinted in the cold northern sun, expanded their borders until they controlled a vast empire. Yet, they were not just soldiers. Inside the dark, cool interiors of their burial mounds, they painted vibrant murals that bring their world to life today. In these paintings, we see the Goguryeo people as they were, hunting tigers in the snow, performing graceful sword dances, and hosting elaborate banquets where musicians played harps and flutes. They were a people who respected strength, but also cherished the beauty of a well-lived life. To the southwest, the kingdom of Baekje developed a very different character. If Goguryeo was the sword of the peninsula, Baekje was its brush. Positioned along the fertile plains of the Han River, Baekje became a sophisticated maritime power. Their ships were the connectors of East Asia, carrying the exquisite incense burners of gilt bronze and the philosophical teachings of Buddhism to the islands of Japan and the courts of China. Picture the capital of Baekje, a place of refined elegance. The air was thick with the scent of sandalwood incense from the many temples that dotted the landscape. The artisans of Baekje possessed a gentle aesthetic, favoring soft curves and natural forms. Their stone pagodas were built with such mathematical precision and artistic grace that they seemed to grow out of the earth itself. It was through Baekje that the light of Buddhist art and the structure of early governance flowed across the seas, leaving an indelible mark on the culture of the entire region. And then, tucked away in the southeast, shielded by the protective embrace of the Gyeongsang Mountains, was Silla. Initially the smallest and most isolated of the three, Silla developed in quiet contemplation. It was a kingdom that valued lineage and spiritual harmony above all else. Silla was governed by the unique bone rank system, a rigid social hierarchy that dictated everything from the color of one's robes to the size of one's home. But within this structure, Silla cultivated a profound intellectual and spiritual life. The most iconic symbol of Silla's spirit was the Warang, the Flower Knights. These were young noblemen who were chosen not just for their lineage, but for their character. They did not just train in the arts of war. They traveled to the most beautiful mountains and rivers of the kingdom to sing, dance, and meditate on the mysteries of the universe. They were taught to be warrior philosophers, embodying a balance of physical prowess and poetic sensitivity. In the quiet of the Silla nights, these young men would gather under the moonlight to discuss the teachings of Buddha and the wisdom of the ancients, preparing themselves to lead their nation with both strength and compassion. Between these three giants lay the Gaia Confederacy, a collection of small, iron-rich polities that clung to the southern coast. Gaia was a land of master smiths and delicate music. It is said that the Gaia Geum, the 12-stringed zither that still produces the quintessential sound of Korea, was born here. Though Gaia was eventually absorbed by its neighbors, its artistic and technological legacy flowed into the veins of the unified kingdom that was to come. As the centuries of the Three Kingdoms period wore on, the rivalry between Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla intensified. It was a long, slow-motion struggle for dominance, a chess match played across centuries of mountain passes and river valleys. Alliances were made and broken like ice on a winter pond. Yet, underneath the conflict, the commonalities were growing stronger. They shared the same language, the same Confucian ethics, and a deep, unifying devotion to Buddhism. The landscape was becoming a sacred map of temples, shrines, and stone Buddhas carved into the living rock of the mountains. The turning point arrived in the 7th century. Silla, through a combination of brilliant diplomacy and the unwavering discipline of its Hwarang-led armies, formed a strategic alliance with the Tang dynasty of China. One by one, the other kingdoms fell. First, Baekje, despite the heroic resistance of its generals, was brought into the fold. Then, the mighty Goguryeo, weakened by internal strife and decades of war with the Chinese, finally succumbed. By the year 676, Silla had done the unthinkable. It had not only defeated its rivals, but had also driven out its former Chinese allies, who had intended to stay and rule. For the first time, the people of the peninsula were united under a single crown. This was the birth of unified Silla, an era that historians often call the Golden Age. Imagine the capital, Gyeongju, during this period of peace. It was a city of nearly 1 million people, a cosmopolitan hub where the markets were filled with glassware from the Roman Empire and spices from the Middle East. The city was laid out in a perfect grid, with wide avenues and magnificent palaces. Above the city, the Sogaram Grotto was constructed, a man-made cave of granite, housing a massive, serene Buddha that looks out toward the East Sea. At sunrise, the first rays of light would strike the Buddha's forehead, symbolizing the light of wisdom spreading across the land. This was a time of immense cultural confidence. The people of unified Silla were masters of the Emil bell, a massive bronze bell whose sound was said to be so pure and deep that it could be heard for miles, its vibrations echoing the heartbeat of the unified nation. They developed advanced woodblock printing, creating the Dharani Sutra, the oldest known printed document in the world. Life was stable, prosperous, and deeply spiritual. But as the centuries passed, the brilliance of Silla began to fade. The rigid bone rank system, which had once provided stability, became a source of resentment. Local lords in the provinces, far from the luxury of Gyeongju, began to grow their own private armies. The central government, distracted by court intrigues, lost its grip on the land. Once again, the peninsula began to fracture into what is known as the later Three Kingdoms. From this chaos, a new leader emerged, Wang Jian, a general of Goguryeo descent. He was a man of immense charisma and inclusive vision. He did not seek to crush his rivals, but to bring them together through marriage, diplomacy, and a shared sense of destiny. In 918, he founded the Goryeo dynasty, and by 936, he had once again unified the land. Goryeo was a kingdom of renewed energy. It moved the capital north to Kaesong and embraced a spirit of intellectual openness. This was the era that gave the world its name for the peninsula, Korea. Goryeo was a maritime power and a center of global trade. Its artisans created the world-famous Goryeo celadon, pottery with a translucent green glaze that was so beautiful it was described as the secret color of the forest. They were also pioneers of technology, inventing movable metal type long before it appeared in Europe, and carving the Tripitaka Koreana, over 80,000 wooden blocks of Buddhist scriptures, a monumental task undertaken as a spiritual defense against foreign invasion. For nearly 500 years, Goryeo stood as a beacon of culture and resilience. It faced immense challenges, including the terrifying expansion of the Mongol Empire. For 30 years, The people of Goryeo resisted the Mongol horsemen, retreating to the island of Ganghwa and maintaining their government in exile. Though they eventually reached a peace agreement, the spirit of the Goryeo people remained unbroken. As we rest here in the twilight of Goryeo, we see a people who have been forged by the elements and the eras. They have moved from the mythical dreams of Dangun to the warrior heights of Goguryeo, the artistic grace of Baekje, and the golden peace of Silla. They have survived invasions and internal strife, always emerging with their identity intact. The foundations are now solid. The language, the faith, and the deep love for the land of the morning calm have become as permanent as the granite mountains themselves. The air is turning cool now, and the moon is high above the palace rooftops of Kaesong. The long day of the ancient kingdoms is coming to an end, settling into the quiet of history. But as one cycle ends, another begins. The wisdom of the monks and the strength of the warriors are about to give way to a new era, an age of scholars, of a new alphabet that would give a voice to the common people, and of a dynasty that would define the soul of Korea for 5 centuries to come. Take a deep breath. Feel the stillness of the ancient earth beneath you. The story continues, flowing like the Han River toward the sea. But for now, the world is at peace. The transition from the old world of Goryeo to the long, scholarly morning of the Joseon dynasty was like the slow, deliberate turning of a massive silk scroll. Imagine the year 1392. The air is crisp, and the scent of pine needles is heavy in the mountains surrounding the new capital of Hanyang, the city we now call Seoul. A general named Yi Song-gai, a man of iron will but quiet temperament, has ascended the throne. He did not call his new kingdom after himself, but chose the name Joseon, a name that reaches back thousands of years to the mythical dawn of Dangun, meaning the land of the morning calm. This was a time of profound internal quiet. The vibrant, often chaotic energy of the previous eras, dominated by the mystical and sometimes politically heavy influence of the Buddhist temples, began to recede into the high mountain peaks. In its place, a new philosophy took root in the valleys, Neo-Confucianism. This wasn't just a religion, it was a blueprint for every breath a person took. It taught that the universe was governed by a natural order, and that by cultivating one's own character, a person could bring harmony to their family, their community, and the entire nation. Imagine a world where the highest status was not granted to the man with the sharpest sword, but to the scholar with the most refined brushstroke and the deepest understanding of ancient wisdom. The layout of Seoul itself was a physical manifestation of this new harmony. To the north stood Boguksan, the great guardian mountain, its granite peaks acting as a shield against the cold winds and the restless spirits of the north. To the south, the Han River flowed like a wide, silver ribbon, a source of life and movement. The palaces, such as Gyeongbokgung, were not built to overwhelm the landscape. Instead, they were designed to sit within it, their low, graceful eaves mimicking the slope of the hills. If you were to walk through the palace courtyards in the early 15th century, you would hear the rhythmic, hypnotic sound of scholars chanting classical texts, a sound that blended seamlessly with the rustle of bamboo leaves in the wind. In the center of this burgeoning golden age sat King Sejong the Great, perhaps the most beloved figure in all of Korean history. Sejong was a man who lived in a state of perpetual curiosity. He believed that a king's primary duty was to ensure the well-being of his people, not just their physical safety, but their intellectual dignity. In the mid-1400s, Sejong looked upon his subjects, the farmers tilling the red earth, the weavers at their looms, the merchants in the dusty marketplaces, and felt a deep, lingering sorrow. At that time, the only way to write the Korean language was to use complex Chinese characters. It was a system so difficult and time-consuming that it was effectively a wall, keeping the common people in the dark. A farmer could not write a letter to his family. A widow could not record her grievances to a magistrate. Knowledge was a luxury reserved for the elite. Determined to break this wall, Sejong worked in secret, often staying awake until the stars faded into the dawn, studying the sounds of the human voice. He ignored the protests of his own advisors, who feared that educating the masses would lead to the loss of their own power. In 1443, he unveiled Hangul, a phonetic alphabet that was a masterpiece of scientific simplicity. He designed the consonants to look like the shape of the mouth and tongue as they produced the sounds. He said that a wise man can learn it in a morning, and even a fool can learn it in 10 days. With the birth of Hangul, the Korean soul was given a voice that belonged only to itself. Suddenly, the morning calm was filled with the scratching of pens as commoners finally began to tell their own stories. But Sejong's brilliance did not stop at language. Imagine his court as a sprawling laboratory of the spirit and the mind. He established the Hall of Worthies, a think tank of the brightest scholars in the land. Together, they mapped the stars with new celestial globes, created the world's first standardized rain gauges to help farmers predict the harvest, and refined the art of movable metal type printing until it was the most advanced in the world. This was the Golden Age, a time when the peninsula felt as though it had reached a state of perfect, scholarly grace. Yet, even in the most peaceful of times, the tides of history eventually turn. As the centuries drifted by, the strict adherence to Confucian rituals began to create a society that was increasingly rigid and inward-looking. The hermit kingdom began to close its doors to the outside world, focusing entirely on the internal cultivation of the mind and the strict hierarchy of the family. In the late 16th century, this peace was shattered by a storm from the east. The Japanese leader, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, launched a massive invasion, seeking to use Korea as a stepping stone to conquer China. The ensuing Imjin War was a period of unimaginable fire and shadow. The ancient palaces were burned, and the quiet villages were turned into battlefields. But it was in this darkness that another of Korea's legendary figures rose to prominence, Admiral Yi Sun-sin. Picture the admiral standing on the deck of his turtle ship, the Jeobukcheon. It was a vessel unlike anything the world had ever seen, its top covered in iron plates and sharp spikes to prevent boarding, its bow shaped like a dragon's head that breathed out clouds of toxic smoke to disorient the enemy. Admiral Yi was a man of unbreakable integrity. Even when he was stripped of his rank by a jealous court, he returned to the sea when his country needed him most. In the Battle of Myeongyang, he faced a fleet of 133 enemy ships with only 13 of his own. He did not rely on luck. He relied on a deep, intimate knowledge of the sea. He used the treacherous, swirling currents of the strait to pull the massive Japanese fleet into a chaotic tangle, defeating them against impossible odds. His victories saved the dynasty and left a legacy of resilience that is still felt in the pulse of the nation today. Following the wars, Joseon retreated even further into itself. For nearly 300 years, the peninsula became a world of ancestral rites and scholarly retreats. Imagine the life of a Yangban, a member of the scholar gentry. Their days were defined by the pursuit of the way. They wore flowing white robes and tall horsehair hats, symbols of their purity and status. They lived in hanok houses, where the ondol floor heating systems kept them warm during the long, snowy winters. The aesthetics of this era were defined by moon jars, white porcelain vessels that were simple, unadorned, and slightly asymmetrical, reflecting the Confucian ideal of beauty found in nature's own imperfections. In the rural villages, the rhythm of life was dictated by the lunar calendar and the collective strength of the community. Every year, during the harvest moon of Chuseok, the villages would come alive. Imagine the scent of steaming rice cakes and the sound of the pung mo, traditional folk music with its driving drums and clashing gongs, echoing through the valleys. The people would gather for the Gangang Sule circle dance, their silhouettes moving against the giant amber moon as they sang songs of hope and gratitude. This was a world where the individual was secondary to the family, and the family was secondary to the ancestors. However, as the 19th century dawned, the hermit kingdom found that the walls it had built were no longer high enough. The black ships of the Western powers began to appear on the horizon, seeking trade and influence. The world was changing at a terrifying speed, entering an age of steam and iron that the Neo-Confucian scholars were ill-prepared to understand. The Joseon court became a place of tragic tension. On one side were those who believed that opening the doors was the only way to survive. On the other were those who believed that any contact with the barbarian West would pollute the Korean soul. In the middle of this struggle was Empress Myeongzong, a woman of sharp intellect and political bravery. She tried to navigate the treacherous waters of international diplomacy, attempting to modernize the country while fending off the growing ambitions of Japan, Russia, and China. Imagine the atmosphere in Seoul in the late 1800s. The first electric streetlights were being installed next to ancient palace gates. The sound of telegraph machines began to mix with the quiet chanting of the monks. It was a poignant, fragile moment. A kingdom caught between the dignity of its 500-year past and the uncertainty of a modern future. The morning calm was being replaced by the long, encroaching shadows of empire. The Joseon dynasty had given the people an identity, a language, and a moral heart, but it was now standing on the edge of a precipice. The transition from the world of kings and scholars to the world of soldiers and industrial giants was about to begin, and it would be a transition marked by both profound tragedy and incredible endurance. As the sun sets over the tiled roofs of the old city, the world is hushed. The long era of the Joseon kings is drawing to a close, but the spirit they forged, the love of learning, the respect for the past, and the quiet strength of the community, would be the very things that would allow the people to survive the storms that were gathering just beyond the horizon. Take a deep breath. Feel the stillness of the palace grounds, where the shadows of the ancient pines grow long. The story of the unified kingdom is reaching its final chapters, but the story of the people is only just beginning to enter its most challenging and transformative era. A note on the journey. As we close this chapter on the Joseon dynasty, we have traveled from the birth of a scholar's dream to the defensive fires of the sea, and finally to the quiet, fragile twilight of the hermit kingdom. We've seen how a single alphabet could liberate a people's mind, and how a deep commitment to tradition could both protect and isolate a nation. In the next part, the narrative will shift away from the stable rhythms of the dynasties and into the turbulent, fast-moving waters of the 20th century. We will witness the loss of sovereignty, the struggle for independence, and the resilience of a people who refuse to let their culture be erased. But for now, let the quiet wisdom of the Joseon scholars settle over you like a warm blanket as we prepare for the long road ahead. The story of Korea is a story of endurance, and as we move forward, that endurance will become the central theme of every word spoken. For now, rest in the memory of the morning calm. The fading light of the Joseon dynasty was not a quick extinguishing of a flame, but a long, agonizing twilight that stretched across the final decades of the 19th century. Imagine the air in Seoul during the 1880s and 90s. It was a heavy, electric atmosphere where the scent of ancient pine and ceremonial incense began to mix with the sharp, acrid smell of coal smoke and the metallic tang of a world in upheaval. For the first time in 500 years, the morning calm was broken by the rhythmic clatter of telegraph machines and the shrill, distant whistles of steamships docked at Incheon. These were the heralds of a new age, one that the Hermit Kingdom had spent centuries trying to keep at bay. To understand the shadow that was falling, one must picture the world outside Korea's borders. To the west, the ancient Qing dynasty of China was fracturing under the weight of its own history. To the north, the Russian Empire was expanding its reaches toward the warm waters of the Pacific. And to the east, Japan had undergone a startling transformation, shedding its samurai past for the steel and steam of a modern industrial power. Korea sat at the center of this geopolitical storm, a strategic bridge that every empire desired, but none truly respected. Inside the walls of Gyeongbokgung Palace, the atmosphere was thick with a suffocating tension. Imagine the young King Gojong and his brilliant consort, Queen Min, later known to history as Empress Myeongzong. The queen was a woman of exceptional intellect and political courage. She understood, perhaps better than anyone in the court, that for Korea to survive, it could no longer hide behind its mountain walls. She attempted to navigate a path through the storm, playing the great powers against one another in a desperate game of diplomatic chess. She sought out alliances with Russia to counter the growing influence of Japan, and she encouraged the modernization of the military and the education system. But the forces aligned against the dynasty were ruthless. In the pre-dawn hours of October 8, 1895, a group of assassins, acting under foreign direction, infiltrated the private chambers of the palace. The empress was murdered, a brutal act intended to decapitate the Korean leadership and break the spirit of the resistance. The silence that followed her death was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, hollow silence of a nation that had lost its heart. King Gojong, fearing for his life and the life of the crown prince, fled the palace in a commoner's palanquin, seeking refuge in the Russian legation. For a year, the sovereign of Korea ruled his people from behind the walls of a foreign embassy, a heartbreaking image of a kingdom in eclipse. In 1897, in a final, poignant attempt to reclaim his nation's sovereignty and dignity, Gojong returned to his people and declared the birth of the Korean Empire. He performed the ancient rites at the altar of heaven, trading his red royal robes for the golden yellow of an emperor, signifying that Korea was no longer a vassal state to any power. For a brief few years, there was a flicker of hope, a Gwangmu reform era. Imagine the first electric streetcars clattering through the streets of Seoul, even before they were common in many major Western cities. Imagine the birth of modern schools, where students studied both the classics of Confucius and the sciences of the West, and the establishment of the first modern hospitals and postal systems. There was a sense that the land of the morning calm might yet find its footing in the modern world while keeping its soul intact. But the tides of war were indifferent to these dreams. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 turned the Korean peninsula into a battlefield for foreign empires. When the smoke cleared and Japan emerged as the victor, the fate of Korea was effectively sealed in distant boardrooms and foreign capitals. In 1905, the Ulsa Treaty was forced upon the Korean ministers at bayonet point, stripping the nation of its right to conduct its own foreign policy. Korea became a protectorate, a nation in name only. King Gojong tried one last, desperate act of diplomacy, sending secret envoys to the Hague Peace Conference in 1907 to plead for international help. But the world was deaf to their cries. For his defiance, Gojong was forced to abdicate his throne, passing the crown to his son Sunjong, who would become the final tragic monarch of the Joseon line. The year 1910 marks a day of national mourning that still resonates in the pulse of the peninsula. In August of that year, the annexation treaty was signed, and Korea was officially absorbed into the Japanese Empire. For the first time in millennia, the Korean people had lost their sovereign land. The mourning calm was replaced by a period of intense, systemic colonial rule that sought not just to govern the land, but to rewrite the very identity of the people. Imagine the decades that followed as a long, cold winter for the Korean spirit. The colonial administration moved with cold efficiency to dismantle the old world. Ancient palaces were partially torn down to make way for grey stone government buildings. The Japanese language became the only language allowed in schools and public offices. History books were rewritten to diminish the glory of the Korean past, and eventually the people were pressured to abandon their family names, names that had been held for centuries, and adopt foreign ones. The land itself was remapped, its resources extracted to fuel a growing war machine, and its farmers were often reduced to tenants on their own ancestral soil. Yet, as the shadows grew longer, the spirit of resilience began to burn with a new, quiet intensity. The resistance was not a single movement, but 1,000 different fires burning in the hearts of the people. In the rugged mountains of the north, the righteous armies, guerrilla fighters composed of former soldiers, scholars, and farmers, fought a desperate war against the colonial gendarmes. They were often outgunned and outnumbered, but they fought for the memory of the land they loved. In the cities, the resistance took a more intellectual but no less dangerous form. Imagine students gathering in the back rooms of tea houses, whispering the forbidden verses of poets like Han Yong-un and Yi Sang-hwa, who wrote of a lost spring and the yearning for a land that was truly theirs. They studied their history in secret, passing around hand-copied manuscripts of Hangul texts to ensure that the language of King Sejong would not be forgotten. This groundswell of national identity culminated in the March 1st movement of 1919. Imagine the scene in Seoul's Pagoda Park on a bright, cold spring morning. 33 cultural and religious leaders gathered to read a Declaration of Independence. It was not a call for violence, but a profound statement of the human right to self-determination. The declaration was signed not just with ink, but with the collective soul of a people. Within hours, the spark ignited a wildfire. Millions of people across the peninsula, from wealthy merchants to the lowliest laborers, from elderly monks to young schoolgirls, took to the streets. They waved the banned Korean flag, the Taegukgi, and shouted, "Mans! May Korea live 10,000 years." It was one of the largest peaceful demonstrations in human history. One of the most enduring symbols of this movement was Yu Gwon's son, a 16-year-old student who organized protests in her home village. Even when imprisoned and subjected to immense hardship, she never stopped shouting for independence, becoming a beacon of courage for generations to come. Though the March 1st movement was suppressed with great force, it changed the course of the struggle forever. It proved to the world, and more importantly to the Koreans themselves, that their culture and their will could not be colonized. In the wake of the uprising, a provisional government of the Republic of Korea was established in exile in Shanghai. For the next 26 years, this government in exile would act as the symbolic heart of the nation, coordinating diplomatic efforts and supporting independence fighters across the globe. The 1930s and early 1940s brought the darkest days of the occupation as the world spiraled toward global conflict. As the war in the Pacific intensified, the pressure on the Korean people became almost unbearable. Thousands of young men were conscripted into forced labor or the imperial military. Resources were stripped so bare that families were forced to surrender their brass bowls and spoons to be melted down for munitions. Perhaps most tragically, thousands of young women were deceived or forced into a system of unimaginable suffering that remains a source of profound sorrow and tension today. But even in the deepest midnight, the people looked for the dawn. They tuned in to forbidden radio broadcasts, listening to the muffled news of the Allied advances. In the quiet of their homes, mothers continued to teach their children the Korean alphabet in whispers, keeping the flame of identity alive behind closed doors. The resistance evolved. The Korean Liberation Army was formed in China, training for the day they could return to their homeland. When the end finally came on August 15, 1945, it was as if a great weight had been lifted from the chest of the nation. Imagine the scenes in the streets of Seoul, people weeping with a joy so profound it was almost silent, the forbidden flags appearing in every window as if they had been waiting in the shadows for this exact moment. The sound of the Korean language, spoken openly and loudly, rang out through the marketplaces. People who had lived their entire adult lives under a foreign shadow suddenly stepped out into the sun. But as the celebrations continued, a new and confusing reality began to emerge. The liberation was not a simple return to the morning calm. The world had changed, and the peninsula was no longer just a bridge between empires, but a focal point in a new global struggle between ideologies. As the Japanese administrators packed their bags and the first soldiers of the United States and the Soviet Union arrived, a line was being drawn, a line at the 38th parallel that no one at the time realized would become one of the most significant borders in the world. As we rest here in the immediate aftermath of 1945, we see a people who have survived the impossible. They have lost their monarchy, their sovereignty, and for a time their name. But they have emerged with their spirit unbroken. The foundations laid by the ancient kings and the scholars of Joseon had held firm against the storm. The winter of empire was over, but the spring that followed was to be a complicated, fragmented season, leading toward a divide that would shape the destiny of every Korean for the rest of the century. Take a deep breath. Feel the immense relief and the simmering uncertainty of that summer in 1945. The story of the unified people is about to take its most tragic and dramatic turn. But the resilience they forged in the shadow of empire will be the very thing that carries them through the fire to come. The joy of August 1945 was a sunrise that many Koreans feared they would never live to see. Imagine the sheer, overwhelming physical sensation of that liberation. The sound of the forbidden national anthem rising from the throats of thousands in the streets of Seoul. The sight of the Taegyuki flag being unfurled from windows where it had been hidden for decades. And the simple, profound dignity of speaking one's native tongue without fear. For a few brief weeks, the peninsula breathed as one. The long, suffocating winter of colonial rule had finally broken, and the morning calm seemed poised to return in all its ancient glory. But as the summer heat began to fade into the crisp air of autumn, the atmosphere changed. A different kind of silence began to settle over the valleys, a colder, more clinical silence that carried the weight of a world being carved into pieces by distant powers. The map of the Korean peninsula, which had remained a single, unified entity for over a millennium, was about to be altered by a pencil stroke made in a room thousands of miles away. In the final days of the war, two young American colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, were given a task that would change the destiny of millions. They were told to find a way to divide the responsibility for the Japanese surrender between the United States and the Soviet Union. Using a map from an issue of National Geographic, they looked for a recognizable line. They chose the 38th parallel, a horizontal line that cut across the waist of the peninsula, roughly in the middle. It was intended to be a temporary, administrative convenience, a line on paper to manage the logistics of a surrendering empire. No one in that room understood that they were drawing a scar across the heart of a people, a scar that would eventually harden into a wall of stone, wire, and blood. As the Soviet troops moved into the north and American troops arrived in the south, the 38th parallel transformed from an abstract coordinate into a physical reality. Imagine a farmer whose ancestral lands were suddenly bisected by this invisible boundary. One day he could walk freely to the neighboring village to trade grain. The next, he was met by a soldier with a foreign accent and a rifle, telling him that the world beyond that line was no longer his. This was the beginning of the Great Unraveling. The peninsula was no longer just a home for Koreans. It had become the front line of the Cold War, a laboratory for two competing visions of how humanity should live, work, and dream. In the north, the Soviet administration moved with a quiet, systematic intensity. They sought a leader who could embody the revolutionary spirit of the resistance, and they found him in Kim Il-sung. Kim was a young, charismatic guerrilla fighter who had spent years in the rugged mountains of Manchuria and the military camps of the Soviet Union. To the people of the North, weary of the old feudal hierarchies and the scars of occupation, his message of radical change was powerful. Imagine the scenes in Pyongyang as the old world was dismantled. Land was seized from the wealthy and redistributed to the peasants. The factories were nationalized, and a new social order was forged under the banner of Juche, a philosophy of self-reliance. It was a vision of a workers' paradise, built on the promise of equality, yet it was a paradise being constructed with a rigid, uncompromising discipline that brooked no dissent. Meanwhile, south of the parallel, the American military government was struggling to manage a chaotic and vibrant landscape. The South was a swirling kaleidoscope of political voices. There were socialists, conservatives, returning exiles, and local activists, all shouting to be heard in the new daylight of freedom. At the center of this storm was Syngman Rhee, an elderly, iron-willed statesman who had spent the better part of 40 years in the United States, lobbying for Korean independence. Rhee was a man of deep contradictions, a scholar with a Western education who held on to the fierce, uncompromising spirit of a traditional autocrat. He was a staunch anti-communist who saw the survival of Korea as being inextricably linked to the democratic West. Seoul became a city of intense, often violent political energy. Newspapers flourished, labor unions formed, and protests filled the streets as the struggle to define the new republic became a battle for the very soul of the South. As the months of 1946 and 1947 drifted by, the hope for a unified government began to wither like a lotus in an early frost. The Joint Commission between the United States and the Soviet Union, intended to coordinate the transition to independence, descended into a series of endless, fruitless arguments. Each side was more concerned with the global chessboard of the Cold War than with the local reality of the Korean people. Families who had lived together for generations suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a border they were not allowed to cross. A son in the north could no longer visit his aging parents in the south. A merchant in Kaesong found his trade routes severed. A bride found herself separated from her husband by a line she couldn't see but could certainly feel. This period of waiting was perhaps the most agonizing. The peninsula was in a state of suspended animation, caught between a past that was gone and a future that refused to arrive. In the south, The instability led to tragic outbursts of violence, such as the uprising on Jeju Island, where the ideological divide turned neighbor against neighbor in a cycle of repression and rebellion that left deep, unhealed wounds. In the north, the consolidation of power became absolute, as any voice that didn't align with the revolutionary path was systematically silenced. The morning calm was now a deceptive peace, a surface that looked still while the currents beneath were turning into a whirlpool. The year 1948 was the year the fracture became official. In May, under the supervision of the United Nations, elections were held in the South, leading to the inauguration of the Republic of Korea, with Syngman Rhee as its first president. Weeks later, in September, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed in the north, with Kim Il-sung at its helm. 2 states, 2 leaders, and 2 diametrically opposed ideologies now claimed sole legitimacy over the same people and the same history. The 38th parallel was no longer an administrative line. It was a militarized frontier. The sound of temple bells and the songs of farmers were increasingly replaced by the rhythmic marching of boots and the low, ominous rumble of military convoys moving through the night. By 1949, the superpowers began to withdraw their main combat troops, leaving behind 2 young, heavily armed, and deeply suspicious nations. The air over the peninsula was thick with the rhetoric of liberation and unification. Both Rhee and Kim spoke of a day when they would lead their armies across the line to reunite the house that had been split in 2. The world watched with a sense of mounting dread, recognizing that Korea had become a tinderbox. The border regions became zones of constant skirmishes, small, localized battles where soldiers traded fire across the hills, testing each other's resolve in the quiet hours before dawn. Imagine the quiet rural landscapes along the 38th parallel during that final year of peace. The rice paddies were still being planted, the children were still walking to school, and the seasonal festivals were still being observed. But the joy was brittle. People lived with a constant low-grade fever of anxiety. They looked at the hills to the north or the south and wondered if the people on the other side were still their brothers, or if they had become something else entirely. The collective memory of a unified people, forged through the Silla Golden Age and the 5 centuries of Joseon, was being challenged by the new, sharp edges of the 20th century. The story of this division is not just a story of politics. It is a story of a deep psychological wounding. For millennia, the Korean people had identified as a single family, a single blood. Now, they were being told that their neighbors' ideas were a mortal threat to their own existence. The transition from the shared hardship of the Japanese occupation to the fratricidal tension of the late 1940s was a journey into a dark and unfamiliar forest. The sense of national destiny, once so clear and unified, was now a fractured mirror, reflecting 2 different versions of the truth. As the spring of 1950 arrived, the tension reached a breaking point. The intelligence reports were buzzing with news of troop movements, of tanks being delivered to the north, of intensified training in the south. The international community was distracted by other crises, but on the peninsula, the feeling of an impending storm was undeniable. The land of the morning calm was holding its breath, waiting for the first crack of thunder that would signal the end of the waiting and the beginning of a tragedy that would define the rest of the century. The nights in June of 1950 were unusually heavy. The summer rains were beginning to fall, washing the dust from the ancient palace tiles and the modern barracks alike. In the quiet of the night, one could almost hear the heartbeat of the nation, fast and irregular. The unity that had survived empires and invasions was about to be put through the ultimate trial, a trial of fire that would leave no part of the land untouched. As the final hours of peace drifted away like smoke, we see a Korea that stands on the precipice of a great, dark void. The names of the dynasties and the scholars fade into the background as the names of generals and battlefields begin to take their place. The long road from the ancient legends of Dangun to the modern divide has led to this singular, terrifying moment. The story is no longer about the past. It is about a present that is about to explode into 1,000 pieces. Take a moment to simply exist in that final, fragile silence. The world is about to change forever, and the resilience that has been the hallmark of the Korean people is about to be tested in a way that even the greatest of their ancestors could never have imagined. The fog is rolling in from the sea, obscuring the line at the 38th parallel. But the storm that is coming will be impossible to hide. The narrative of a house divided is reaching its climax, and as the first light of dawn begins to touch the peaks of the Taebaek Mountains on the morning of June 25th, the silence is finally violently broken. The waiting is over, and the long, weary journey through the fog of war is about to begin. The silence of that rainy Sunday morning, the 25th of June, 1950, was not broken by a single crack of thunder, but by a sound that would reverberate through the valleys of the peninsula for generations to come. Imagine the pre-dawn light, a soft, hazy grey filtered through the heavy summer downpour of the monsoon season. In the quiet villages along the 38th parallel, the only sound should have been the rhythmic drip of water from thatched eaves and the occasional stirring of livestock. But instead, the earth began to tremble. The low guttural growl of heavy engines and the metallic clatter of tank treads began to drown out the rain. The morning calm was shattered in an instant as the North Korean People's Army surged across the border, setting in motion a conflict that would turn the landscape of the peninsula into a tapestry of fire, shadow, and unyielding endurance. The speed of the initial advance was startling. Within days, the ancient gates of Seoul, which had stood through centuries of dynastic change, watched as T-34 tanks rolled through the city streets. Imagine the confusion and the sheer heart-stopping fear of the citizens, waking to find their world turned upside down, their capital occupied before they could even grasp the scale of the invasion. The South Korean forces, outmatched in armor and heavy artillery, were forced into a desperate fighting retreat. They moved south, through the winding mountain passes and across the swollen rivers, as the heat of the Korean summer began to bake the mud of the rice paddies into a hard, cracked crust. This was the beginning of the Pusan perimeter, a final, semicircular line of defense around the southeastern port city of Pusan. It was a thin, fragile strand of territory, the last foothold of the Republic of Korea, where soldiers and refugees alike stood with their backs to the sea, listening to the encroaching sound of the front lines drawing closer every night. As the world watched in stunned realization, the newly formed United Nations acted with a speed rarely seen in international diplomacy. For the first time, a global body committed itself to a police action, sending troops from 16 different nations to a land many of them could not have found on a map just weeks prior. Imagine the docks of Pusan, a chaotic symphony of languages, English, Turkish, Greek, Thai, as ships arrived from across the oceans, unloading men and machines into the humid air. The perimeter held, but only just. The battles were fought in the grueling heat, among the steep, pine-covered ridges where the air was thick with the scent of cordite and the relentless buzzing of cicadas. It was a war of hills, where every peak was a fortress and every valley a potential trap. Then, in September of 1950, the momentum of the war shifted with the suddenness of a mountain landslide. General Douglas MacArthur, executed one of the most daring and controversial gambles in military history, the Incheon landing. Imagine the yellow, silt-heavy waters of the Incheon harbor, where the tides are among the most extreme in the world. As the sun began to set, a massive armada appeared through the mist. The amphibious assault struck far behind the North Korean lines, cutting their supply routes and recapturing Seoul in a matter of days. The images of that time show a city in ruins, the skeletal remains of the central government building standing as a silent witness to the intensity of the street fighting. The tide had turned, and the UN forces began to push north, crossing the 38th parallel and racing toward the Amnok River, the Yalu, which marked the border with China. But as the autumn leaves turned to brilliant shades of crimson and gold, a new and colder shadow began to fall. The warnings from the north grew louder, but they were largely ignored in the euphoria of the advance. As the first snows began to dust the jagged peaks of the northern mountains, hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteer Army soldiers began to move across the frozen Yalu River under the cover of darkness. They moved with a ghostly silence, traveling only by night and hiding in the deep, snowy ravines during the day. In late October and November, the trap was sprung. The war, which many had thought would be over by Christmas, was suddenly transformed into a completely different conflict. The winter of 1950 to 1951 remains etched in the collective memory as a time of crystalline, bone-deep cold. Imagine the Chosin Reservoir, a high mountainous plateau where the temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The air was so cold it felt like a physical weight. Breath turned to ice on the scarves of the soldiers, and the metal of their rifles became painful to the touch. In this frozen wasteland, the UN forces found themselves surrounded and vastly outnumbered. The breakout from Chosin became a legendary tale of endurance. The soldiers marched through the narrow, wind-swept passes, their boots crunching on the deep snow, as the night was filled with the sound of bugles and the sudden terrifying flares of the Chinese attacks. It was a landscape of absolute white and deep, freezing shadow, where the struggle was as much against the elements as it was against the enemy. The retreat from the north was long and bitter. Seoul changed hands again, and then once more, as the front lines surged back and forth across the waste of the peninsula like a violent tide. By the spring of 1951, the war had reached a grim equilibrium near the original border of the 38th parallel. The era of rapid movement and sweeping advances was over. In its place came a war of attrition, a static, grinding conflict that resembled the trench warfare of a previous generation, but set in the vertical, unforgiving terrain of the Korean mountains. Picture the front lines during these final 2 years. The hills were given names that spoke of the suffering they witnessed. Pork Chop Hill, Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, Old Baldy. The peaks were stripped of their ancient forests by constant bombardment, leaving behind grey, lunar landscapes of pulverized rock and splintered timber. The soldiers lived in elaborate networks of bunkers and trenches carved into the granite, their lives measured by the routine of patrols and the terrifying intensity of localized night attacks. The Seesaw War meant that the same few hundred yards of a ridge might be lost and won dozens of times, with neither side able to achieve a definitive breakthrough. While the soldiers occupied the hills, the sky above the peninsula became a canvas for the first great jet-to-jet battles in history. High above the clouds, in what became known as MiG Alley, the silver streaks of F-86 Sabres and Soviet-built MiG-15s danced in a deadly high-speed ballet. But below the jet trails, the war took a much heavier toll on the land itself. The intense aerial bombardment of the north left virtually no stone unturned. Ancient cities, Irrigation dams and infrastructure were leveled, a devastation that would shape the political consciousness of the northern population for decades to come. Amidst the thunder of the artillery, the human cost was becoming an unbearable weight. Millions of civilians were caught in the crossfire, their lives uprooted by the shifting front lines. Imagine the long columns of refugees, the Pimen, carrying their entire lives in bundles on their backs or in wooden carts, moving south away from the fighting. Mothers carried infants wrapped in quilted blankets, and the elderly leaned on walking sticks as they trudged through the mud and the snow. Families were separated in the chaos of the retreats, a tragedy of dispersed families that remains one of the most poignant legacies of the war. The landscape was a blur of destroyed villages and makeshift shelters, where the primary goal was simply to survive another day of the forgotten war. By July of 1951, the realization that neither side could win a total military victory led to the beginning of peace talks. The negotiations took place first in Kaesong and then in a small, nondescript village called Panmunjom. Imagine the scene inside the peace tent, where generals sat across from one another in a silence so thick it was almost tangible. The talks were agonizingly slow, often stalling for months over a single word or the placement of a chair. The most difficult issue was the exchange of prisoners of war. Thousands of North Korean and Chinese prisoners did not want to return to their home countries, a point the UN insisted upon and the communist side fiercely rejected. As the diplomats argued in the quiet of Panmunjom, the fighting on the hills continued with undiminished ferocity. Every day that the negotiations dragged on meant more names added to the lists of the fallen. The soldiers on the ridges could see the lights of the peace camp in the distance, a mocking reminder of a peace that seemed always out of reach. It was a war of nerves, where the goal of the attacks was no longer to win the war, but to gain leverage at the bargaining table. The hills were covered in the smoke of 1,000 barrages, and the air was heavy with the weariness of a people who had been at war for 3 years, following 35 years of occupation. Finally, in the summer of 1953, a change in the global political climate, the death of Stalin, and a change in leadership in the United States paved the way for an end to the active fighting. On the 27th of July, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. It is important to remember that this was not a peace treaty. It was merely a ceasefire, a promise to stop the shooting. The war did not end. It was simply frozen in time. The agreement created the Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ, a strip of land 4 kilometers wide and 248 kilometers long, cutting across the peninsula from sea to sea. Imagine the final hours before the ceasefire went into effect. The artillery on both sides unleashed a final, deafening barrage, as if trying to expend every last shell before the clock struck 10. And then, at the appointed hour, a profound, jarring silence fell over the mountains. Men stepped out of their bunkers and looked across the valleys at the positions they had been trying to destroy for years. There were no cheers, only a deep, exhausted sense of relief and a lingering, hollow sorrow. As the sun set on the first day of the armistice, the morning calm returned to the peninsula. But it was a calm of a different sort. The land was divided by a scar of barbed wire, minefields and watchtowers that would remain for the rest of the century and beyond. The war had left nearly 3 million people dead, millions more displaced, and every city and village scarred by fire. The unified history that had stretched back to the ancient kingdoms was now physically and ideologically severed. The mountains of the DMZ, once the scene of such violent struggle, slowly began to be reclaimed by nature. Without the presence of humans, the forests began to grow back, and rare birds and animals found a strange, unintended sanctuary in the space between the armies. But for the people on either side of the wire, the journey was just beginning. They looked out over a landscape of ruins, toward a future that was now irrevocably split into two different paths. The smoke of the war was beginning to clear, revealing a north and a south that would now have to learn how to breathe, how to build, and how to survive in the shadow of a line that refused to disappear. The transition from the chaos of the trenches to the daunting task of reconstruction was beginning. The sounds of the bugles and the tanks faded, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of a people picking up the pieces of their broken world. The fog of war was lifting, but the air it left behind was cool and uncertain, as the peninsula began the long, difficult process of defining itself in the wake of a tragedy that had changed everything. As the stars appear over the silent ridges of the 38th parallel, the land settles into a weary rest. The story of the conflict has reached its quiet plateau, but the story of the two Koreas, the miracle of the South and the mystery of the North, is waiting just beyond the horizon, in the first light of a new and divided day. I have completed Part 5. This section contains approximately 15,300 characters, including spaces. It provides a deep, immersive, and sensory exploration of the Korean War, covering the initial invasion, the Pusan perimeter, the Incheon landing, the Chinese intervention, the static war of the hills, the air war, the civilian tragedy, the Panmunjom negotiations, and the signing of the armistice. I have ensured the ending transitions smoothly into the next phase of history. The silence that followed the armistice of 1953 was not the peaceful quiet of a land at rest, but the heavy, ringing silence of a world that had been shattered. Imagine the landscape of the Korean peninsula in the mid-50s. It was a panorama of ash and grey stone, where cities like Seoul and Pyongyang were little more than skeletal remains of their former selves. The rice paddies were riddled with craters, the ancient mountain forests were scorched, and the rivers flowed past bridge pilings that stood like broken teeth in the water. For the millions of survivors, the morning calm had become a bitter irony. They were a people standing in the ruins of their own history, facing a future that had been sliced in two by a line of barbed wire, an ideology that showed no signs of fading. This was the beginning of the Great Divergence, the moment when two societies, sharing the same language, the same ancestors, and the same soil, began to walk in opposite directions. It was a journey that would take them toward two completely different versions of what it meant to be Korean. To understand this era, one must look past the statistics and into the daily lives of the people who, with nothing but their bare hands and an unbreakable will, began the Herculean task of pulling their lives out of the mud. In the South, the immediate post-war years were a time of deep, systemic poverty and political fragility. Imagine the streets of Seoul in the late 1950s, a city of shantytowns and open-air markets where the primary currency was survival. The Republic of Korea was one of the poorest nations on earth, its economy shattered and its infrastructure non-existent. The government of Syngman Rhee, once the symbol of anti-colonial resistance, had become increasingly autocratic and detached from the struggles of the common people. The air was thick with a sense of stagnation, a feeling that the liberation and the sacrifice of the war had led to a dead end. But beneath this surface of despair, a new energy was beginning to simmer. It was an energy born of a unique Korean trait, a desperate, almost spiritual belief in the power of education. Families who could barely afford a bowl of barley would sacrifice everything to send their children to school. In the makeshift classrooms under canvas tents, a generation was being raised to believe that the only way out of the ruins was through the mind. They studied by the light of kerosene lamps, their voices chanting lessons in the dark, preparing for a world they hadn't yet seen. The turning point for the South arrived in the early 1960s, following a student-led revolution that toppled the Rhee government. A young general named Park Chung-hee seized power. Park was a man of intense, single-minded focus. He viewed the poverty of his nation as a personal humiliation and set out to transform the South through a series of ambitious 5-year plans. This was the beginning of the Miracle on the Han River. Imagine the transformation of the landscape. The sound of jackhammers and the sight of rising steel cranes became the new soundtrack of the South. Park's method was a form of guided capitalism. He selected a handful of family-owned businesses and gave them government support, low-interest loans, and protection from foreign competition. These companies, Hyundai, Samsung, Lucky Gold Star, would become the chaebols, the giant conglomerates that would eventually dominate the global market. The South became a nation of builders. They constructed the Gyeongbu Expressway, a ribbon of concrete that connected Seoul to Busan, symbolizing the new, rapid pulse of the nation. They built massive shipyards in Ulsan and steel mills in Pohang, where workers labored in grueling shifts, driven by a sense of national duty and the hope for a better life for their children. This economic explosion came at a high cost. The political atmosphere was one of strict control and the suppression of labor rights. The miracle was built on the backs of workers who put in the longest hours in the world for meager wages. Yet, despite the hardship, the physical reality of life was changing. The thatched roof huts were replaced by brick and cement. The hunger that had defined the post-war years began to recede, and for the first time in memory, a middle class began to emerge from the dust of the war. While the South was beginning its frantic climb toward industrialization, a very different kind of transformation was occurring north of the DMZ. In the years following the armistice, North Korea actually recovered faster than the South. With the support of the Soviet Union and China, Pyongyang was rebuilt as a socialist showcase, a city of wide boulevards, grand monuments, and identical apartment blocks. To a visitor in the 1960s, the North appeared to be the more stable and prosperous of the two. At the center of this world was Kim Il-sung, who was meticulously constructing a cult of personality that would eventually transcend politics and enter the realm of the divine. He introduced the philosophy of Juche, which translates roughly to self-reliance. This was not just a political stance, it was a total worldview. It taught that the North Korean people were the masters of their own destiny, that they must stand independent of all foreign influence, including their own allies. Imagine the atmosphere in the North during this time, a society of absolute mobilization, where every citizen was part of a work team, and every action was dedicated to the great leader. The landscape of the North became a map of ideological devotion. Massive bronze statues of Kim Il-sung were erected in every city, their hands pointing toward a revolutionary future. The people wore pins of the leader over their hearts, and their lives were organized around the Chalima movement, named after a mythical winged horse that could travel 1,000 miles a day. It was a call for heroic, rapid production. The North became a highly industrialized and urbanized society, with a heavy focus on mining, steel, and military strength. They built an underground metro in Pyongyang that doubled as a nuclear bunker, its stations adorned with chandeliers and mosaics depicting a socialist utopia. But as the decades progressed, the paths diverged even further. The North's obsession with self-reliance and its massive military spending began to lead toward isolation and stagnation. The closed nature of the system meant that while it was capable of building heavy industry, it struggled to adapt to the dawning age of electronics and global trade. The great leader had created a society that was perfectly synchronized, but it was a synchronization maintained through absolute control and the elimination of any dissenting thought. The air in the north became static, frozen in a state of perpetual revolution that began to lose its connection to the changing world outside. In the south, the 1970s and 80s were a period of intense, often violent growing pains. The economic success had created a sophisticated, educated population that was no longer willing to accept autocratic rule. The transition from a military dictatorship to a democracy was a journey marked by the scent of tear gas and the sound of chanting voices. Imagine the campus of Seoul National University or the streets of Gwangju in 1980, where students and citizens stood against tanks, demanding the right to choose their own leaders. It was a second liberation, this time from within. The struggle culminated in the late 1980s, just as the eyes of the world turned towards Seoul for the 1988 Summer Olympics. The government, fearing a loss of international prestige, finally bowed to the demands of the people. The South became a vibrant, multi-party democracy. This political opening acted as a second engine for the economy. Free from the shadow of the dictatorship, the South's culture began to flourish. This was the era when the groundwork for the Korean wave was laid, a time when the nation's cinema, music, and art began to find a unique modern voice that blended ancient traditions with the hypermodernity of the high-tech age. By the early 1990s, the contrast between the two Koreas was stark. The South had become a global economic powerhouse, a land of neon-lit skylines, high-speed internet, and a restless, creative energy. It was a society that was constantly reinventing itself, a place where the past and the future collided in a dizzying blur of change. You could walk through a high-tech district in Seoul and, just around a corner, find a quiet temple where the air was still thick with the incense of 1,000 years ago. In the north, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union brought a terrifying new reality. The external support that had propped up the economy vanished overnight. The self-reliance of Juche was put to the ultimate tragic test. As the South was celebrating its newfound prosperity and democratic freedom, the North was entering a period of profound darkness. The centralized distribution system began to fail, and the land was hit by a series of devastating floods and droughts. As the 20th century drew to a close, the divergence was no longer just a matter of ideology or economics. It had become a matter of human biology. Due to the chronic food shortages in the North, a generation was growing up shorter and thinner than their cousins in the South. The line at the 38th parallel was now visible from space at night. The South, a brilliant, interconnected web of light, and the North, a vast, silent void of darkness, save for a few faint glimmers in Pyongyang. The story of these diverging paths is a story of a single people living two completely different lives. One path led toward the global stage, toward a noisy, messy, and brilliant modern democracy. The other path led inward, toward a hermetic, family-ruled state that maintained its identity through a fierce, unyielding devotion to a revolutionary past. They were like two branches of a tree that had been forced to grow in different directions, but whose roots remained entangled in the same ancient soil. As the sun sets over the skyscrapers of Seoul and the dark, quiet hills of the north, the reality of the divide remains the most defining feature of the peninsula. The two Koreas have built two worlds out of the same ruins. They have proved their resilience in different ways, one through change and the other through endurance. But as they look across the DMZ, the question of what it means to be a unified people remains an unfinished sentence, a longing that persists even as the gap between their daily realities grows wider with every passing year. The journey through the decades of rebuilding and divergence has brought us to a world that the ancient kings of Joseon would not recognize. Yet the spirit of the people, their intensity, their devotion to family, and their fierce pride, remains the common thread. The paths have diverged, but the story is far from over. The two Koreas now stand at the threshold of a new millennium, two different versions of the same dream, waiting for the moment when the currents of history might once again bring them back toward a single, unified stream. Take a deep breath and feel the immense distance that has been traveled since the smoke of 1953 cleared. The world is different, but the heart of the peninsula continues to beat, steady and persistent, in the quiet and the light alike. As the 20th century began its final, rapid descent toward the new millennium, the two worlds on the Korean peninsula, already separated by ideology and wire, began to pull apart with a physical and emotional force that felt almost geological in scale. Imagine the atmosphere of the 1990s as a time of extreme weather for the Korean soul. In the south, the air was electric, charged with the neon glow of a burgeoning digital age and the noisy, restless energy of a young democracy. In the north, however, the atmosphere grew cold and heavy, as the structures that had sustained the nation for 40 years began to crack under the weight of a changing world, leading toward a period of profound and tragic silence. To understand the modern contrast, one must first step into the deep, echoing shadow of the North during the mid-1990s. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the lifeblood of subsidized oil and trade that had propped up the North Korean economy vanished. The self-reliance of Juche was no longer a philosophical slogan. It became a grim, daily struggle for survival. This was the era of the arduous march, a time of famine and hardship that left a permanent scar on the northern collective memory. Imagine the quiet in the rural provinces, where the factories stood silent for lack of power, and the once fertile fields were ravaged by a series of biblical floods, followed by punishing droughts. During these years, the state-run distribution system, which had once provided for every citizen, effectively ceased to function. In the void left by the government, a new and unintended reality emerged: the jangmadang, or the informal marketplaces. Imagine a middle-aged woman in a provincial town, selling homemade tofu or a few bundles of firewood in a hidden alleyway to buy a handful of corn for her children. This was the birth of a grassroots capitalism that the state could neither fully control nor do without. It was a time of unimaginable loss, but also a time where the ingenuity of the common people was put to its most desperate test. While the elite in Pyongyang lived in a world of marble monuments and ideological purity, the rest of the nation was forced to learn the hard, practical lessons of a market that didn't care about revolutionary slogans. While the North was enduring its long, dark night, the South was undergoing a transformation that was as much about the spirit as it was about the economy. In 1997, the South was hit by the Asian financial crisis, a shock that felt like a national humiliation. But it was during this crisis that the unique character of the South Korean people was most visible to the world. Imagine the gold collecting campaign, where millions of ordinary citizens, grandmothers, office workers and students, lined up at banks to donate their personal jewelry, wedding bands and heirlooms to help the government pay off its international debt. This collective sacrifice was a modern echo of the communal spirit of the ancient villages, a proof that even in a hypermodern society, the we still held more power than the I. From the ashes of this financial crisis, a new South Korea was born, one that would no longer just be a factory for the world, but a creative powerhouse. The government made a strategic, long-term bet on the creative industries, investing billions into high-speed internet infrastructure and the arts. This was the birth of the Hallyu, or the Korean wave. Imagine the change in the streets of Seoul as the city transformed into a global laboratory of style and sound. The grey, industrial buildings of the past were replaced by architectural masterpieces of glass and light. This was the era of the first K-pop groups, the first high-budget dramas, and the first wave of Korean films that began to capture the attention of audiences from Tokyo to Paris to Los Angeles. The South became a nation of early adopters, a place where the future seemed to arrive 6 months before it did anywhere else. By the mid-2000s, South Korea was the most wired nation on Earth. The rhythmic tapping on smartphones became the new heartbeat of the city. The youth of the South, no longer burdened by the immediate memories of war or poverty, began to express themselves with a vibrancy and a confidence that was infectious. They took the traditional values of hard work and group harmony and infused them with a restless, globalized creativity. K-pop was not just music, it was a total aesthetic, a synchronized, multi-sensory experience that spoke to the digital generation's desire for perfection and connection. But even as the South's cultural influence reached its zenith, the shadow of the North never truly disappeared. The dawn of the new millennium brought a change in leadership in Pyongyang as Kim Jong-il took the helm following his father's death. The North began to seek a different kind of security, focusing its meager resources on a nuclear program. This was the era of the military-first policy. While the South was building digital networks and film sets, the North was carving tunnels into mountains and refining the technology of the atom. The contrast was now visible from space at night. The South was a brilliant, shimmering web of interconnected light, while the North was a vast, silent expanse of darkness, save for the faint, steady glow of the capital. The 2010s brought yet another transition, as Kim Jong-un, the third generation of the dynasty, took power in the North. His era has been marked by a Byung-jin policy, the simultaneous pursuit of nuclear weapons and economic development. Pyongyang began to see a construction boom, with high-rise apartments and water parks designed to give the impression of a modern, prosperous socialist state. At the same time, the border became even tighter, with high-tech surveillance and reinforced fences making the once common paths for defectors across the northern rivers almost impossible to navigate. The mystery of the North deepened, even as it engaged in high-stakes diplomacy on the global stage. In the South, the Korean wave turned into a global tsunami. Groups like BTS and films like Parasite broke through the final barriers of Western pop culture, proving that a story or a song rooted in the specific experiences of the Korean peninsula could resonate with the entire world. But this global success also highlighted the intense pressures of life in the modern South. The competition for success is fierce, starting in the cram schools of childhood and extending into the high-pressure world of the chaebols. The term Hell Joseon emerged among the youth, a satirical look at the struggle for social mobility in a society that still prizes traditional status and hierarchy. The contrast between the two Koreas is now more than just political. It is a contrast of time itself. To move from the high-tech, fast-paced streets of Gangnam to the silent, rural villages of the North is to travel between centuries. In the South, life is lived at a pali-pali, hurry-hurry pace, where a new trend can rise and fall in a single week. In the North, time seems to move in long, slow cycles of revolutionary anniversaries and agricultural seasons, a world where the portrait of a leader remains the most consistent feature of a person's life from birth to old age. Yet, Despite the vast distance between their daily realities, the shared culture of the peninsula remains a persistent, underlying current. You can see it in the way both societies value education, in the way they revere their ancestors, and in the way they find comfort in the same traditional foods, the spicy tang of kimchi, the warmth of a bowl of rice. There is a jong, a unique Korean concept of deep emotional attachment and collective responsibility that survives even in the most isolated of circumstances. It is a feeling that even though they are living in two different worlds, they are still, at their core, a single people waiting for the weather of history to change. The modern contrast is a landscape of extremes. It is the contrast between the world's most advanced semiconductors and the wood-burning trucks of the northern provinces. It is the contrast between a society that debates every political move on social media and a society that maintains its cohesion through absolute, state-mandated unity. It is a story of a nation that has reached the highest peaks of global influence, and a nation that has sought its strength in the deepest isolation. As we look at the peninsula today, we see a mirror that has been shattered into two large pieces. Each piece reflects a different version of the future, yet each piece still bears the marks of the same long dynastic history. The morning calm of the past has been replaced by the modern dynamic of the present. The two Koreas have become two different experiments in what it means to survive and thrive in the 21st century, one through the power of connection and the other through the power of resistance. The air over the peninsula remains thick with the tension of the unfinished war, but it is also filled with the dreams of millions of people who, despite the divide, still look at the same moon and the same stars. The contrast is sharp and the gap is wide, but the story of the Korean people has always been one of unexpected turns and incredible resilience. They are a people who have survived empires, occupations, and fires, and they are now defining what it means to live in the most contrasted landscape on Earth. Take a slow, deep breath and feel the immense complexity of this moment. The transition from the struggles of the late 20th century to the hypermodernity and nuclear tensions of the 21st is complete. The stage is set for the final chapter of our journey, where we look at the silent border today and the shared culture that, like the roots of an ancient tree, continues to reach across the wire in search of a common soil. The world of the two Koreas is a world of light and shadow, of noise and silence, but it is a world that continues to beat with a single, persistent pulse. As the neon lights of Seoul flicker and the fires of the northern villages are banked for the night, the peninsula rests in a state of watchful, divided peace, waiting for what the next dawn might bring. The modern world of the two Koreas, with its neon-lit heights and its silent ideological depths, eventually meets at a single, narrow strip of land that cuts across the peninsula's waste like a jagged scar. This is the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, a place where time has both stopped and accelerated in the most surreal of ways. Imagine yourself standing on a high ridge overlooking this 4-kilometer-wide ribbon of Earth. To the south, you might hear the distant, faint hum of a modern highway. To the north, the silence is occasionally broken by the rhythmic, metallic voice of a propaganda broadcast echoing through the valleys. But here, in the space between the armies, there is a stillness that is unlike anywhere else on the planet. This strip of land, born from the exhaustion of the 1953 armistice, was intended to be a void, a buffer to keep two warring brothers from touching. But in the 7 decades since the wire was first strung, something extraordinary has happened. Because humans are largely forbidden from entering this space, the DMZ has inadvertently become one of the most pristine wilderness sanctuaries in Asia. Imagine the ancient forests of the Tabec Mountains reclaiming the old battlefields, In the absence of tractors and cities, the meadows are filled with rare wildflowers that haven't been seen in such abundance for a century. The red-crowned cranes, symbols of longevity and peace in Korean art, glide over the minefields, their white wings bright against the deep green of the valley. It is a living paradox, a place of extreme military tension that has become a garden of undisturbed peace. If you were to look closer at this silent border, you would see the remnants of the shared history we have traveled through. Beneath the overgrowth lie the ruins of ancient castles from the Goryeo dynasty and the stone markers of Joseon-era villages. The land does not recognize the 38th parallel. The rivers flow across it with a steady, indifferent grace, and the wind carries the scent of the same pine needles from the northern peaks to the southern plains. In this narrow corridor, the dream of a unified peninsula feels both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. You can stand at the joint security area in Panmunjom and see the soldiers of both sides standing inches apart, frozen in a posture of permanent readiness, their eyes fixed on a line that is nothing more than a raised strip of concrete. The DMZ is not just a line on a map. It is a profound human tragedy that lives in the hearts of millions. For decades, the most poignant expression of this divide has been the dispersed families. Imagine a young man in 1950 who left his village in the north to find work in the south, thinking he would be gone for only a week. 70 years later, that man is now a grandfather in Seoul, still clutching a faded black and white photograph of the mother and siblings he never saw again. On the rare occasions when family reunions have been allowed at Mount Kumgang, the scenes are heart-wrenching. These are meetings of strangers who share the same blood, people who have lived entire lifetimes in two different universes, weeping over a shared past that was stolen from them by the currents of history. They speak the same language, yet they find that 70 years of separation have created new gaps, different words for everyday things, different ways of seeing the world. This divergence of the spirit is perhaps the greatest challenge of the silent border. In the South, the language has become a vibrant, chaotic mix of ancient roots and modern global loanwords. In the North, the language has been purified, stripped of foreign influence, and shaped into a tool of revolutionary unity. Yet, despite these changes, the fundamental rhythm of the Korean soul persists. Whether in a high-rise in Busan or a communal farm near Hamhung, the values of the family, the respect for education, and the deep, abiding love for the landscape remain the same. The Jeong, that uniquely Korean bond of affection and collective responsibility, is like a root system that continues to grow beneath the barbed wire, connecting the two halves in ways that politics cannot fully sever. In the quiet hours of the night, the DMZ becomes a place of shadows and stories. It is the path for those who seek to cross from one world to the other, a journey of immense peril. Imagine a defector moving through the tall grass, their heart hammering against their ribs as they navigate the silence. For those who make it to the south, the transition is like stepping out of a time machine. They must learn to live in a world of overwhelming choice, of relentless speed, and of a freedom that can be as terrifying as it is liberating. They carry the North with them, the memories of the quiet villages, the songs of their childhood, and the faces of those they left behind. They are the living bridges between the two Koreas, individuals who embody the complexity of the divide in every breath they take. As we look toward the future, the question of the border remains the great unfinished sentence of the Korean story. There have been moments of profound hope, the Sunshine Policy, the historic summits where leaders from both sides shook hands over the line, and the joint industrial zones where workers from the north and south labored side by side. During these times, the morning calm, seemed almost within reach. The dream of a Koryo confederacy or a unified republic is not just a political goal. It is a yearning for wholeness, a desire to heal the wound that was opened in 1945. It is the hope that one day the trains will once again run from Pusan to Pyongyang and onward to the heart of Eurasia, turning the peninsula back into the vibrant bridge it has always been. But unification is a mountain that grows taller even as we approach it. The economic, social, and psychological gaps between the two societies are vast. The youth of the South, who have grown up in a world of global influence, often feel a dwindling connection to a brother they have never known. In the North, the absolute devotion to the state remains a powerful, unifying force that is resistant to change. The silent border is a reflection of this stalemate, a place where the past is preserved in amber and the future is a flickering light on the horizon. Yet, history has taught us that the Korean people are a people of the long view. They have survived centuries of dynastic shifts, the fires of invasion, and the long winter of occupation. They have proven that they can build a global miracle out of ash and maintain an identity through the deepest isolation. The current divide, as long and painful as it has been, is but a single chapter in a story that stretches back to the legends of Dangun and the ancient sandalwood tree. The resilience that allowed Silla to unify the three kingdoms and the scholars of Joseon to create a voice for the common people is still there, waiting for the right moment to manifest once again. Imagine a day when the wire is finally taken down, not with a bang, but with a quiet, collective realization that the line is no longer necessary. The land would not change. It has been waiting for this moment for 70 years. The cranes would still fly over the marshes, and the pine trees would still scent the air. But the silence of the border would be replaced by the sound of voices, the chatter of traders, the laughter of children on school trips to the northern mountains, and the quiet conversations of families finally sitting down to a meal together without the shadow of the wire. As we reach the end of our journey through the complete history of this eternal peninsula, we see a people who have been forged by the elements and the eras into something truly unique. They are a people of intense passion and quiet dignity, of high-tech ambition and ancient tradition. The story of North and South Korea is not a story of two different nations, but a story of a single family that has been forced to live in two different rooms. The wall between those rooms is thick and the door is locked, but they still hear each other through the partitions. They still share the same moon, the same stars, and the same deep-seated hope that the morning calm will one day be a reality for the entire land. The air over the DMZ is cool tonight, and the stars are brilliant and steady over the peaks of the Tabaek Mountains. The landscape is at peace, even if the people are not yet. The long road from the foundations of Gojoseon, through the golden ages and the shadows of empire, to the modern miracle and the nuclear mystery, has led us here, to this quiet ridge overlooking the silent border. The history is heavy, the tragedy is real, but the endurance of the Korean spirit is the most powerful force of all. Take a slow, deep breath and let the weight of the centuries settle over you. Feel the vastness of the time we have traveled, from the bronze daggers of the ancients to the semiconductors of today. The peninsula rests, caught in its divided sleep, but the pulse of the nation is steady. The journey through the fire and the fog has created a people who know how to survive anything. And as the night deepens, that strength is a quiet, reassuring presence in the dark. The story is not over. It is merely waiting for the next dawn. The transition from the divided present to an unknown future is a path that the Korean people will walk with the same resilience they have shown for 5,000 years. For now, let the quiet of the silent border be a blanket of peace. The world is still, the mountains are ancient, and the dream of unity remains, as constant and as patient as the granite peaks themselves. As the final echoes of our journey fade into the soft mist of the valleys, the morning calm settles over the entire peninsula, a promise whispered by the wind to the sea. Rest now, in the knowledge that the story continues, and that the spirit of this land is as unbreakable as the sunrise. As the final echoes of this journey through the Korean peninsula fade into the quiet of the night, take a moment to appreciate the incredible endurance of the human spirit. We have traveled from the mythical peaks of Gojoseon to the neon-lit streets of modern Seoul, witnessing a story of resilience that few other nations can claim. The morning calm is not just a name. It is a testament to a people who have survived the storms of time and kept their soul intact. As the final echoes of this journey through the Korean peninsula fade into the quiet of the night, take a moment to appreciate the incredible endurance of the human spirit. We have traveled from the mythical peaks of Gojoseon to the neon-lit streets of modern Seoul, witnessing a story of resilience that few other nations can claim. The morning calm is not just a name. It is a testament to a people who have survived the storms of time and kept their soul intact. A moment of connection. If you found peace in these stories and value the deep, rhythmic exploration of our shared history, I invite you to become a permanent part of our community. Like this video. A simple tap helps our quiet narratives reach more people who, like you, are searching for a moment of calm in a busy world. Subscribe to History to Relax. By joining us, you ensure that every new journey into the past is waiting for you whenever you need to drift away. As the final echoes of this journey through the Korean peninsula fade into the quiet of the night, take a moment to appreciate the incredible endurance of the human spirit. We have traveled from the mythical peaks of Gojoseon to the neon-lit streets of modern Seoul, witnessing a story of resilience that few other nations can claim. The morning calm is not just a name. It is a testament to a people who have survived the storms of time and kept their soul intact. A moment of connection. If you found peace in these stories and value the deep, rhythmic exploration of our shared history, I invite you to become a permanent part of our community. Like this video. A simple tap helps our quiet narratives reach more people who, like you, are searching for a moment of calm in a busy world. Subscribe to History to Relax. By joining us, you ensure that every new journey into the past is waiting for you whenever you need to drift away. Share your thoughts. If there is a specific era or a personal reflection that resonated with you tonight, feel free to leave a gentle comment below. Final rest. Now, let the weight of the centuries settle comfortably around you. The history is written, the lessons are learned, and the world outside is hushed. There is nothing left for you to do but breathe and rest. The mountains are standing guard, the rivers are flowing steady, and the stars remain unchanged. Thank you for traveling with me tonight. Until our next journey through the annals of time, sleep deeply, dream of ancient peace, and wake refreshed to your own modern morning. Good night. Share your thoughts. If there is a specific era or a personal reflection that resonated with you tonight, feel free to leave a gentle comment below.